Liberals are gathered right now in downtown Toronto to choose their new leader. To get the latest on the state of the race, here's Adam Radwanski, Queen's Park columnist with the Globe and Mail. And Adam, as always, it's good to have you back in our studio.
Good to be here, thanks.
Let us just share with our viewers numbers that you are all too well aware of. Here's where they stand right now among publicly acknowledged elected delegates. If we could, control room, let's get these numbers up. As you know, Sandra Pupatello from Windsor is in first with about 27+% of the delegates. Kathleen Wynne from Toronto is in second. Gerard Kennedy is in third. He's at 14. Harinder Thakkar from Mississauga has got 13%. Charles Sousa, 11%. And Eric Hoskins from Midtown Toronto has 6%. These are the elected delegates, not including the ex officio delegates, the superdelegates who don't have to say who they're supporting. But that's roughly where things stand on ballot one. That doesn't take into account who's hot, who's not, who's got momentum, where things are fluidly moving. What can you add to that?
Sure. I think, first of all, there's a couple of things we know will happen after the first ballot. I mean, one of them is Eric Hoskins will be out of the race. Who he goes to will be the first interesting question, and despite his relatively low level of support, he's going to have a bit of influence just in creating momentum. So we know that. I think we also know that the gulf between Pupatello and Wynne and the rest of the field will be as wide, or probably wider than it is now, because they have more of the ex officio support, so the sort of party elites who automatically get votes. So we know that'll happen. Beyond that, it really is hard to guess. I mean, I find it very hard to believe, although everybody worries that maybe we're missing this angle, that anybody other than the two frontrunners will wind up winning, because there's just such a big gap. I don't see Gerard Kennedy, who's running third, being the kind of person who gets enough momentum to really challenge. The question is, does there start to be, sort of a lot of momentum around one of the two frontrunners? At this moment, it seems like Sandra Pupatello has a bit more of it. She came out, I think, better than expected when they did the delegate election meetings. I think she's had some, she's gotten endorsements, which I don't know how much endorsements matter or don't. I like to think they do because I work at a newspaper, but she's gotten them from us and from the Toronto Star, and that latter one I think does matter a lot to Liberals. So she's certainly having a good couple weeks heading into it. I think what's interesting is, can she get past the concerns about what happens if she wins? And as you've noted and others have, she doesn't have a seat.
Okay, hold off on that. I'm going to go to that angle in a second.
So I think that's a concern that could cause problems, and I'm sure we'll get to that.
But bottom line, what you're saying is, we're going to have a woman premier by this time tomorrow night.
I'd be shocked if we didn't.
You'd be shocked if we didn't?
I'd be shocked if we didn't.
There's no alternative scenario that sees some compromise candidate come up the
middle?
There
is. I mean, there is one in that Gerard Kennedy is trying to gather the other candidates around him. I've heard from both the Pupatello and Wynne camps that that Kennedy people are talking about something called the Gentleman's Club, which I have a hard time believing they're calling it that, but I don't. They claim that they are.
If they are, that's bad.
It's a very bad idea. But look, there is that possibility that the other candidates somehow go to the candidate in third, which is Kennedy. I find it very unlikely. He's not the kind of person who naturally is a compromise candidate. He's too divisive. I also think there'd be some awareness from some of the other candidates and their supporters about the optics of that. Do you really want, you've got two female frontrunners, all four male candidates ganging up to elect one of them over the front? I just have a hard time seeing it. Are
you picking up, I don't want to push this comparison too much, but there were millions of Americans who were very excited about the notion of electing the first ever black man to be president in their lifetime. Are you picking up any of the same kind of thing which says we'd be very excited to have a female premier led by either Wynne or Pupatello?
Not a ton, I don't think, and I think partly because it's become more normalized. I mean, I think in several other provinces already have female premiers. I don't think it would be that shocking if we did. One of the opposition leaders is a woman, so I don't think it's created that much excitement. I think it is to some people, including some people who vote Liberal. Their support base is quite heavily female. I do think there's some appeal there, but I don't think it's sort of a, wow, I can't believe this is happening moment.
Eric Hoskins, as you point out, has to drop off first, more than likely, unless he picks up a remarkable number of ex officios. So we assume he's off first, which means he will be the first guy to really plant a flag in the ground for who's got momentum. Could you weigh the two options of which way he's going right now?
I think the general expectation is it's likeliest that he would go to Kathleen Wynne, just because it seems as though he's seen, fairly or not, and these things get overgeneralized, but he's seen as being a little bit more on the left side of the party, as she is. He's also a Toronto MPP, as she is. His supporters would seem more naturally aligned with her. So all of those are factors. That being said, I'm not completely sure that you're guaranteed that Eric Hoskins is the kind of guy who brings all of his delegates to one or another place. He doesn't have, you see some candidates who have these sort of vote blocks around them, a couple of the other candidates included. He's got people, he didn't have that great an organization, and what he does have is some people who are kind of, they're people who may have just liked him. They may have been impressed by him on the trail. They won't necessarily say, okay, we're going wherever that guy goes.
But if he goes somewhere, he does create the impression of momentum.
Yes, and you have to assume the majority of his delegates would go there. And I think certainly Kathleen Wynne absolutely needs him to go to her. I mean, if he doesn't, she's got a big problem.
If he goes to Pupatello,
she's
game over?
Not necessarily game over, because it depends what the other candidates do, but it puts Pupatello in very good shape if that happens, and may create a sense of inevitability around her.
Do you have a sense about these 400 and some odd ex officio delegates and how they're breaking out?
Yeah, I think first of all, I'm not sure all 400 plus will turn up. That includes things like people like former MPPs who, I heard from some of the campaigns, they don't even know where to find some of these people. So they're not all.
Well, we know
not all
one of
be
them
there.
Robert Nixon, the former party leader who lives in Brandon, who's 84 and will not become.
Exactly, and some of them live out of the country, and so they're not all going to be there. So it'll probably be more in the 300 something range. They'll break, and they seem to be breaking most heavily toward Pupatello, but they're also there's a strong contingent for Wynne. Again, that's why the gulf is going to grow between them and the rest of the field, because I think they're so much ahead in terms of ex officio from the other candidates. So those two will have the most. I think the least you have to think would be Harinder Takar, who's had a very kind of localized campaign in some ridings and not a lot of support from party establishment. So that could hurt him in terms of where he winds up coming in on first ballot. You could see him drop because of that.
The candidates all started here. They are now here, almost at the finish line.
Yeah.
What has impressed you the most through the course of all of this?
It's been an incredibly compressed campaign, hasn't it? I mean, it's usually these things last so much longer, so you don't really see as much sort of a storyline through the whole thing as you usually would. I think what has impressed me, a couple of the actually most of them actually have improved. I mean, I think you watch all of them in debate number 1 and even in debate number 5, which was now a little while ago. Most of them are considerably better, and I think most of them have not gone through this before. None of them have gone through this before. So the most improvement you'll see would be at the lower end. I think Eric Hoskins is probably the most improved candidate in this. It didn't help him with his numbers, but it certainly created a positive impression, because really he looked awfully green at the start, and he looked quite commanding, I thought, in a couple of final appearances. But even at the higher end, Kathleen Wynne, I think, is somebody who's had to grow in a bit to sort of this kind of campaign mode, or she would argue that she used to know it and kind of forgot it in all her time as a minister. I found her excessively sort of technocratic at the start of the campaign. I found her less like that then. She still has that tendency to not be quite as strong and forceful publicly as she should be.
She's heavy on policy. She's
heavy on policy, but she's gotten better and sharper, I think, during it. And even the Sandra Pupatello, who I think came in with the most sort of campaign skills, she did sort of soften her edges a little bit. I mean, in the first appearance, and I remember I watched the webcast of it because I wasn't able to go live, and it was like she was sort of jumping through my screen at me. I mean, she was so forceful and over the top, and I think she's been coached and learned and toned it down a bit. So they've all kind of improved, but they're all works in progress, because it has been a pretty short campaign.
On the other hand, Pupatello did say, as I look at the candidates, I have to admit, I'm the best and I'd vote for me. Does that border on arrogance, and is that a problem for her?
Yeah, and she's had a bunch of comments like that. I mean, she also said at one point that the party would lose without her as the leader. I think that has had a problem for her. I think she's tried somewhat to tone it down recently, but it's not just her, it's also her campaign team. I mean, you've heard some complaints from the other camps that they have not been respectful of them. There's this incident where she was sitting down with Gerard Kennedy for dinner, and he wound up learning during the dinner of something that a supporter of hers had said over Twitter or on a blog, I'm not sure which, and sort of the dinner kind of blew up. And I mean, these are minor things, but I think one thing is that you really do have to show respect in this kind of thing for the other candidates. And if you're an Eric Hoskins or a Charles Sousa or a Harinder Takar, one thing you really want out of this is respect. I mean, you don't want to be embarrassed out of it. You want to come out in a better place than you were before and know that you're valued by your party. And she has not done the best job of that during the campaign. And it's partly just that, as you would know from interviewing her, she's a little less guarded and scripted than some of the other candidates, and she says stuff more off the cuff.
Which is part of her charm.
Part of her charm. But it has rubbed people the wrong way, and I think it's a bit of a problem for her, because she obviously needs at least a couple of those people to back her on the later ballot.
Having said that, this seems to me to be one of the most collegial leadership contests I've ever seen. You don't see a lot of major league sniping among the candidates or even among their staff. Have you found that too?
I would agree with that. I mean, almost none, and then the little things are getting amplified. I don't think there's much. I think there is a sense of some growing tension between the two frontrunners. I don't know how you can avoid that, to be honest.
But it's not hatred.
It's not hatred. I don't get the sense of much between the candidates. I mean, I don't know. They're very different people. Kathleen Wynne and Sandra Pupatello are incredibly different people. I don't get the sense of a whole lot of mutual animosity. Again, between their supporters, there's a bunch, but not to the extent that you would have seen previously, and certainly not like the last time the provincial Liberals chose a leader back in '96, when it took them years to get over some of the rifts that came out of that. I don't see that happening this time.
Okay, let's go back to one of the issues you raised right at the beginning of this, which certainly the Wynne people are highlighting, which is that Kathleen Wynne has a seat in the legislature if she wins the leadership contest. On February 19th, the legislature reconvenes. She is set from day one to get back in the House and get things back in business. Sandra Pupatello does not have a seat. She would have to have a by-election called. That would take extra time. Is that an issue?
I think it is. It's an issue for me. I'd like next week to be relatively calm. But other than that, I think it is an issue. And I think it's something that, look, there's all kinds of uncertainty about what happens if Sandra Pupatello wins. You know, there are speculation about how she handles that. The by-election that she runs in, if she runs, is not necessarily for a safe seat. You know, what you can expect to see is pretty much every union in the province practically would descend into Windsor to try to defeat her. It's a riding that's held federally by the NDP. I mean, it's just not a guarantee. On top of that,
Windsor-Tecumseh, Dwight Dutton's seat.
Yes, and on top of that, I do wonder a bit, how on earth do you manage to juggle everything that you have to do as the incoming premier, from reconfiguring the premier's office to preparing a budget, and we were already into budget season really, to writing a throne speech, to all of that. So it's enormously challenging on top of running a by-election.
Ernie Eves did it 10 years ago.
He did, not in a minority legislature though. And
not in the minority parliament.
It becomes particularly messy. So there's all of that, and I think one concern for her, for Sandra Pupatello, is that the other candidates, a couple in particular, really don't want an election anytime soon. And there's concern that when you look at the scenario, what this really means is there may not even be a by-election. We may just go straight into an election pretty soon. And if you're particularly Charles Sousa and to a lesser extent Harinder Takar, who are the candidates probably likeliest to go to her and who she needs, they're both in Mississauga ridings that are not that safe, particularly Sousa. And you're hearing a lot of concern from them about what we're looking at if she wins, and whether that's, I don't know how much it's giving them pause, but it definitely is giving them pause, because I've had it raised to me by people in those camps as, yeah, there is this danger of an election under Sandra, and that may be something that they're just not comfortable with.
Because the Liberals are not ready to go.
Liberals aren't ready to go, they're not good in the polls, and look, people who are in government tend to like staying in government, and people with seats would prefer to keep their seats for as long as possible, and particularly in Charles Sousa's riding, if you look at where the Liberals are at right now, he could very easily lose that, and you know, he'd, I think, rather take some time and try and see the party rebuild. So I'm not saying that'll necessarily affect his final decision, but I think it's something that's weighing on them, and it's probably Pupatello's biggest barrier to getting some of those folks on board.
Is it an added wrinkle that if Sandra Pupatello were to win, she hasn't got a seat in the legislature, so the government exists, but the premier isn't in the House isn't called back, the finance minister would resign so she could run in his seat. We'd have a government without a premier in the legislature and essentially without a finance minister either, about 2 months before a budget's going to be presented. Is that an issue?
I mean, we have to assume that there would be a new finance minister, that she would swear in a cabinet.
Temporarily.
But there'd be a finance minister presumably around the same time there would be under Kathleen Wynne. So something would happen on preparation. But as I said, I think what concerns me about that scenario personally a little bit is that, you know, we are, as a province, a little behind already on budget. I mean, usually you'd be well into preparations. This person is going to have to present an agenda, and frankly, it's not as though this campaign has fleshed out a particularly clear governing agenda from any of the candidates. So you think there's going to be a lot of work to do there. There's a lot of overhaul in terms of staff and everything else, and I do wonder a bit. I mean, if somebody's forced to be campaigning in a riding for a lot of that period, which I think realistically, you know, she kind of brushed that off when she was on the editorial board this week. Well, you know, she's popular in Windsor and she's not that concerned, and she's campaigned, she's won elections there where she's not even been in the riding much, she's been helping the party elsewhere and blah, blah, blah. But I don't think it's a guarantee. So can she afford to not be around? I mean, it's certainly a consideration, and if you're just worried about stability, I think it is a concern.
Let me ask you about another meeting that took place at the Globe and Mail editorial board, and that's Kathleen Wynne's, during which time she said to the members of your board, "I want to be known as the social justice premier." I'd like to know how the members of the Globe editorial board reacted to that.
Yeah, well, maybe it wasn't the right message for that particular audience. I think it raised some concern. I mean, I'm not on the editorial board, I was previously, but I was at the meeting. I think there was some concern because when you look at the province's challenges right now, they look mostly to be on the fiscal side. It is a period, I think, that's been widely identified as a period of belt tightening. So I think there's concern that her priorities may not be in sync with the province's needs right now. Now, in fairness to her, she's been pretty clear during the campaign that she would continue along the same deficit timeline. She's talked about fairly wonky issues like debt to GDP ratios and so on that are meant to show that she takes fiscal issues seriously. I think she probably does, but I think she showed a little bit, where her kind of passion lies, and I think that certainly raised some concerns, because it did kind of drive home the idea that she's a little closer. When you use those words, drives home the idea you're a little bit closer to where the NDP is and where the Conservatives are, and I think under the current circumstances that caused some worry.
If you're a Liberal delegate and you want this government to last longer, and you want the new leader to be able to have good relationships with the other side, in order that the minority parliament works and lasts longer, who's the best bet?
I don't think there's any way of getting around that it's Kathleen Wynne in that case. Look, the situation we've got in the legislature, and I've written a bunch about this, I mean, it is a somewhat fundamentally flawed configuration we've got right now. We've got a province that does have most needs that would seem to trend more toward some form of fiscal conservatism, but the party on the right, I mean, it's pretty clear that the Conservatives have very little interest in propping up the government at all. So the only party that really you can work with is the NDP. I don't see a scenario, I mean, you never know, but I don't see one in which Pupatello is able to work closely with the NDP. It just doesn't seem to align.
Well, particularly if you've just beat their brains in during a by-election run.
That too. And just everything from ideologically to even personality, it just doesn't seem like it would fit that well.
Having said that, if you find yourself into an election earlier than you wanted to, who'd be the best bet to take on Tim Hudak and Andrea Horwath at a leaders' debate?
I think the general consensus is that Pupatello is more ready for that. I think I would probably agree with that. I mean, I think in terms of the way she communicates, I think Wynne has more to do in terms of the way she presents herself in a forceful way. Just on day-to-day on the campaign, you can see her fading into the background a bit, which is a concern. The Wynne people would argue, and I don't think they're necessarily wrong on this, that Liberals have to worry more about bleeding votes to the left than to the right. Even if they're worried about Tim Hudak getting elected, that when the NDP gets over a certain level, Liberals are pretty much doomed. There is a fair argument on that, and I think that's something Pupatello has to address, is can she also take on the NDP, because it's really not just the Conservatives they have to worry about.
Ironically, a little bit lost in the shuffle of all of this is what's happening right now, which is a tribute to the man who has been the leader of the party for 16 years and led them to power for 9, the first Liberal leader in 128 years to win 3 consecutive elections. You may remember his name. It was Dalton McGuinty. It still is Dalton McGuinty. My question is, how important do you think it is that the new leader distances himself, from the old leader?
I remember his name, but we haven't heard a lot during this campaign, right? I mean, I think that's part of what you're getting at, which is that I think there is going to be an effort to distance themselves, and I think they do need to a point. It's really hard in this situation, and history would suggest that it fails more often than it succeeds, to try to take over somebody's accumulated credibility to some extent, but not inherit their baggage. Often you seem to get the other. You get all the baggage and not the credibility. I think it depends who it is in terms of how they approach that. I mean, I think Pupatello seems to have a view, and this is certainly how she's viewed within their party, and I think externally, of being a little closer to the McGuinty legacy, a little more surrounded by people who were around him, and probably a little more of a stay-the-course message. I think what you'd see from Kathleen Wynne is probably a little more of an attempt to break from that. But even then, what we're really talking about more with her, or even George Kennedy, what they've really been talking about more is kind of going back to what worked for this government in its first term, and kind of pretending the last little bit didn't exist, or trying to get away from that. So I don't think you're really going to see them completely disavowing it. I think what they're going to say is, we need to go back to what worked for us before.
In our last 30 seconds here, I don't know if you make predictions, but if you want to, now's the time.
It's a very tough one, because in my head it's about 52 one way and 48 the other way, just in terms of probabilities. My gut tells me that Pupatello's got a better shot of winning. When I play out different scenarios and have fun with numbers, it comes out more that way more often than the other way.
Which ballot?
4th.
4 ballots?
Yeah, 3 or 4. I would say 4.
Okay. Adam Radwanski, always a pleasure having you in the studio. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.